Hello everyone, this is Reach of the Sky, and I am back with my third tank video. This time I'm covering the T-34, the glorious Russian killing machine that was responsible for scaring the living daylights out of the Germans in early 1941. It's easy to see why when you look at the design of this vehicle. The T-34 began its road to success with its development from a tank called the A-20. The A-20 was a lot like the T-34 in that it incorporated a big powerful engine on a agile chassis with sloped armour. The T-34 was essentially the best tank in the world when it was introduced in 1939. It had the sloped armour, had a big powerful V12 engine. It was fast, manoeuvrable, and it was well armed. The 76mm gun was capable of penetrating virtually any tank that other nations could field in 1939. So the first tank in War Thunder, and there are many variants of the T-34 in War Thunder, so this will probably be a fairly long video. But as many variants as there are even more variants that haven't been included in the game yet. For example, the Model 1943. But let's begin at the beginning. This tank I've got here is the T-34 prototype. It's a Tier 1 with a battle rating of 2.3, I believe. Yes. The T-34 prototype is developed from the T-32, which was designed to be a replacement of the BT series. It combines sloped armour with a powerful gun and a powerful engine, and it was designed to run on diesel fuel, which gave it an increased range and reduced the risk of fire. And this tank was ready in early 1939, ready for production. Now the T-34 prototype gave way to the 1940 model. Now this had quite a complex hull. That was a problem with the early models. As you can see here, the hull has the machine gun mounting there, the hatches, the towing hooks. This was all moulded as a single plate of steel, and that was quite difficult to produce. Bending the metal round the mould, it took a lot of time, but that was simplified later on. The Model 1940 replaced the T-26, the BT-7 and the T-28, a multi-turreted tank. It was given production priority over all these tanks. It was armed with the 76mm L11 cannon, which was capable of penetrating 65mm of armour at 500 metres, which was seriously bad news for the Germans because their most well-armed tanks in June 1941 rarely had more than 50mm of armour. The Panzer IIIJ, for example, had just 50mm. The early variants of the Panzer IV had no more than 50mm, so this was a serious problem. And that coupled with the armour. The armour is 45mm sloped at 45 degrees, which gives it approximately 70mm of equivalent flat steel, which meant the T-34 could penetrate the Germans at long range, excuse me, and the Germans couldn't penetrate it back, so this tank was nearly invulnerable throughout 1941. And its very powerful V12 engine gave it a high top speed, good acceleration, could cross rough terrain quite easily, but there was a shortage of V12s in late 1941 because lots of T-34s were being destroyed, or there were so many T-34s being built that the engine production couldn't keep up with the demand, so sometimes the Model 1940 was fitted with the BT-7's engine. Next up is the Model 1941. Now this was streamlined and simplified for mass production, which meant that the design, while it was easier to produce and cheaper to produce, it was a tank that caused some problems. The simplification, for example, included a large single hatch here, this large wide hatch instead of two smaller ones. Now that was fine in a sense of making production easier, but this hatch was very heavy to lift. See the size of it, it's twice the size of a normal hatch. And it's also was prone to jamming, so if that hatch jammed, which it sometimes did, and the tank burst into flames, then the crew would unfortunately burn alive. The small turret is also a problem with the earlier models of the T-34. There was only room for 2 men the commander and the gunner, which meant there was no loader in the turret. So the commander had to load shells, which meant he was distracted from the job of actually commanding the tank. But some things were improved. For example, the L11 cannon, which lacked muzzle velocity, was replaced by the F-34 cannon, also 76mm, which was capable of penetrating 74mm of armor at 500 meters. So that was the main selling factor of this model, the improved penetration. And from the model 1941, the T-34E was developed. This is it here, Tier 2 premium tank, battle rating 3.3. There's the 41, 2.7, and the 40, 2.3. So the T-34E is built on the model 1941. I believe it is. Has it got the same gun? F-34, F-34, yes. T-34, the E stands for ekranami, which means with plates. And the plates it's referring to here is these bolted-on plates on the side of the hull and around the turret. And it's also got some armoured skirts along the top of the chassis, the track. But these plates were 15mm thick, so that means the side armour here is up to 60mm and 60mm around the turret. This was introduced as a response to the rising power of German guns, like the 50mm L60 and the 75mm L43. So that was a response to an increase in penetration that the Russian tanks faced. Next up is the T-34 model 1942. This was largely similar to the 1941, despite complaints from crews which said the 41 had some serious flaws, like for example the small turret, lack of protection for the commander. The 42 introduced these boxes at the back, which were used for storage, mostly tools, crew possessions. But yeah, there was still, most of the flaws weren't addressed because the high command were more interested in prioritising low cost and ease of production. But there were some improvements. As you may have noticed, there's a new Model D turret, hexagonal, six-sided, and the problematic single wide hatch was replaced by two round hatches. And when these two round hatches were risen up, it looked like Mickey Mouse's ears, so the Germans nicknamed this model the Mickey Mouse tank. There was more room in this turret. It still didn't have a three-man turret, but there was more room, more space. And this turret meant there was more protection. The armour was thicker from the side. The armour is more angled instead of the rounder plate, which could have had less chance of bouncing a shot in the middle. And there's also an improved mantlet. You can see the cheeks here protected the crew behind the mantlet. So, new turret, which went some way to improving the situation. Now the T-34-57, this was a modified T-34 1941 with a 57mm ZIS-4 gun, which was a purpose-built tank killer. This was capable of penetrating 95mm of armour at 500 meters. This was a tank hunter, designed primarily to deal with enemy tanks, because obviously the 57mm shell has a less powerful, high explosive filling, but there's better penetration. This model saw a lot of action during the Battle of Moscow, so December 1941, this tank really helped to hold back the mechanized panzer divisions that were pushing for Moscow. So the 57 had quite an important role to play. This premium tank here, the T-34-57 Model 43, battle rating 4.3. There's the original 57, battle rating 3.7. The Model 43 was very similar to the initial 57. But this was the 57 idea was brought back in response to the large number of Panthers and Tigers encountered at Kursk. The Russians saw that they needed a more powerful gun being mounted in larger numbers on their readily available T-34 chassis. So the 57mm was brought back into importance by the situation at Kursk. Compared to the initial 57, this had a ZAS-4M. It was modified with a new breech that matched other breeches that were being used in the T-34, which simplified production. But other than the new breech, it was very similar. But obviously, since it's based on the 1942, it's got the hexagonal turret. So that's how it differs to the other 57. It's got the new Model D turret found on the 42. Next up is the first version of the T-34-85 seen in War Thunder. Battle rating 4.7, Tier 3. This replaced the initial 76mm with the more powerful gun, and a new 3-man turret. As you can see, the turret is much larger. The 57mm gun, while an improvement over the 76, still wasn't found adequate to deal with the largest of German tanks, so the turret ring of the T-34 was widened, which allowed a larger turret and therefore a larger gun. This is the D5T 85mm, which was capable of penetrating 105mm of armour at 500 metres, so it could quite easily knock out a Tiger from 500 metres away. This turret came from a tank which some of you may have heard of, called the T-43. The T-43 was designed to be a modernised a replacement for the T-34, but it never came to fruition. But this turret was a direct result of that project, and it was mounted on the T-34. This initial version of the 85 had a very short production run, which lasted from February to March 1944. But this was replaced quickly by the next T-34-85 you see here, Tier 4 Battle Rating 5.0, which had the ZAS S53, I believe. Yes, S53. This gun was initially planned to be used with the T-34-85, but the designers who won the contract to have their gun mounted in the T-34 found that it wouldn't fit in the turret initially because the D5T was already in service in the Russian army, so it was more readily available to be fitted into the turret. But eventually the tank was customized to allow this simplified gun to be added, and the main difference is it was simpler to operate, which created a faster rate of fire. So you can see here reload time 10 seconds and 9.3 seconds, and this also came with an improved gunner sight, which was clearer and made engaging targets at a distance easier. So that's the basics of all the variants you've seen War Thunder at the moment. A very influential tank design on the history of. In history, it's regarded as one of the most influential tanks. The combination of sloped armour, mobility, and protection. The firepower as well. So this was a very impressive tank. Saw service throughout the war. Even in 1945, the T-34-85 was still in the front lines. But to summarise how to play this tank, you can split the T-34s into two groups. The ones Tier 2 and below, and the ones Tier 3 and above. The Tier 2 and below variants, the armour is more reliable. You're more likely to bounce shots because lower tier enemy guns, particularly the German guns, aren't always powerful enough to penetrate you, especially with the prototype and the Model 1940. There's a lot of armour for guns like the KWK-38. Even the L-60 will struggle unless he's close, but after Tier 3 the opposite is true. The armour is less adequate. I mean, the hull is still the same, even on the last model of the 85 here. It's still 45mm at 45 degrees, so you're not going to bounce anything unless you're very lucky. But unlike the Tier 2 variants, which had a somewhat unreliable penetration, if you see here, the T-34-42 for example, that penetration will struggle with later models of the Panzer IV and some of the German tank destroyers. The Tier 3 and after T-34s have much more powerful, reliable guns which can go through the front of most German tanks. Things like the Panther are going to be problematic, especially at this angle, but one thing to note, especially with the earlier variants, is, if you remember earlier I mentioned the two-man turret design. This created a problem where, obviously, with only 2 men in the turret, there's no designated loader, so the rate of fire suffered. If you look at the stat card here, 8.1 second reload, improved to 7.1 with the 1942, 7.1 on the 1941, sorry, and 7.2 on the 1942, so no faster than 7 seconds with those early variants. If you compare that to the equivalent German tanks, 4.6 seconds, 4.8 seconds, 6.9 seconds. The Germans are going to be firing faster than you because they've got 3-man turrets. So that's something to keep in mind. Now the T-34 isn't invincible, but it's very fast. It's a robust tank. Especially the later variants have very powerful guns, which are capable of damaging nearly all opponents you'll face. And the kinetic energy of the 85mm shell is impressive because it weighs a lot. There's a lot of explosive filling. So thank you very much for listening and watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and see you soon.